Hello, everybody. My name is Iveta Silova, and I am Associate Dean of Global Engagement and Professor in International and Comparative Education at Mary Lou Fulton Teachers College at Arizona State University. And I would like to welcome all of you to our event today on education in Afghanistan, what comes next. And we are absolutely thrilled to host and welcome Rangina Hamidi, who is an Afghan-American writer, speaker, educator, social activist, and politician. Hamidi served as a Minister of Education in Afghanistan until the Taliban takeover in 2021. She is well known as an advocate for women's rights in Afghanistan and strongly believes in the power of education as a main catalyst for change. Rangina now also serves as a professor of practice at ASU, and we are absolutely thrilled to have her here and to engage in a conversation with Rangina and everybody else here about the future of education in Afghanistan. So we will start with a conversation between me and Rangina, and we will then open also the floor for questions from the audience as well. So feel free to post your questions in the chat. Feel free to also share your reactions to the conversation. And you can also use the Q&A feature for the questions as well to help us monitor which questions we have answered and which ones still are coming up. But so welcome everybody again. As those of you who are just joining, please introduce yourself and we'll start the conversation now. Rather than starting with a chronological biography, as often such conversations go, questions about how Rangina became the Minister of Education of Afghanistan, I'd like to start at a different point in time, at a time when, Rangina, your work as a Minister of Education abruptly ended in the summer of 2021. Can you tell us more about these last few months, weeks, days in the office? What were your main concerns then? And what are your main worries today?
Well, thank you. And salam alaikum. Good morning to everybody joining from all over the world, hopefully. I'll begin with the day of August 15, 2021. I went to my work, to my ministry, just like any other day. It's not that I was unwilling to accept the reality that so much was happening around us. But part of, just being so crazy in love with what I was doing for changing the future of education for the children of Afghanistan, I didn't allow anything to stop me from achieving the goals that I had set, trying to put in place the reform agenda that we had envisioned as a team, to revamp or to rewrite the whole structure of what education really meant for Afghanistan. And so even on the day of the 15th of August 2021, I went to work only to be disrupted or interrupted by commotion and noise outside in the hallways of the ministry, where my secretary and staff came and said that people, and this was around 10:30 a.m., that people from the ministry are running and, saying that the government has collapsed. And I actually went outside and confronted the men who were running and causing the commotion, because, they believed that the government had collapsed. And so I went outside and told one man who told me, I said, what's going on? They said, the Taliban have come, the government has collapsed. And I said, if the government has collapsed, then what am I doing here? And for many of the men who saw me there were surprised that I, as a female minister in that, very chaotic situation or time, was actually there. And I said, continue doing your work. And even if the Taliban come to power, or not to power, but even if the Taliban come, why are you afraid of them? So I did the best I could in my capacity as a minister, a female minister of education, to the last minute. And even still, not fleeing the country or not leaving the country immediately. I guess I was partly staying also in the hopes of wishing for something different than what we got. I was still in shock and in disbelief that the international community had turned its back so drastically and so quickly on the Afghan people and the Afghan society. But it was tense, to say the least. But from what I can remember and what I can recount, my administrative office at the Ministry of Education, with my deputies and my directors that had newly been appointed to their positions, there was this passionate vision created among us to do things differently than what the Ministry of Education had seen in the past 20 years. And I think the exact 14 months that I served my position, I have no regrets. And I'm proud to say that I gave it my best. But at the end, of course, as many things political, politics, unfortunately, not sometimes, but most of the time, kill even the most ambitious visions created by people all over the world. So I'm one of that ambition that was killed very quickly, but not just at the Ministry of Education. The whole country of Afghanistan was, left in a position where it is very, very difficult to predict its future.
Exactly, Rangina, but let's maybe then move back in time a little bit. And let me ask you this question. When you first assumed the position of the Minister of Education, what were your main priorities and goals? And what were you able to accomplish while you were in office for that 15 months? And what did remain unfinished?
Sure.
What are you maybe regretting the most?
That's a great question, and a question that, of course, on the surface, many people were not able to see, the work that I and my team tried to accomplish in the short time that we were there. I think that the biggest surprise that I got by joining the ministry is to quickly learn how political the Ministry of Education really was in Afghanistan. People talked about it, but it's one thing to hear it. It's another thing to actually live it and experience it. I found, having 17 advisors appointed to the minister position, they remained the day I arrived. And to my great surprise, not a single one of the 17 advisors working with the ministry had an educational background in the sense of understanding what education is. And so that in a nutshell kind of tells you, what the Ministry of Education was doing. What I had brought in and why I accepted the position was to simply force the administration of the Ministry of Education to think about education as a technical service to the future and the children of Afghanistan, and dare to do things differently. After 20 years of international investment, much training, over $1 billion spent on teacher training to build the capacity of teachers in Afghanistan. In 2020, when I assumed the position, we were still graduating children in the country after 12 years who were still illiterate, meaning they still did not have basic reading and numeracy skills. Now, of course, that's not a picture for everybody, but to have that or to lack that quality was a great concern. And the fact that we were now living in the 21st century, the skills, the knowledge, the information that we were giving to our children, could you even compare it to the skill sets needed to be able to survive and to live and to prepare, these young people for the 21st century, if not at the global scale, at least even at the regional scale. And we had that challenge. And additionally, the biggest assumption that I came with was that we were daring to make the Ministry of Education a technical ministry that would focus on education, provide the service of education, and deliver the promise that we have made to education. Now, of course, that was met with a lot of resistance, with a lot of animosity, particularly towards me, not only because I was a woman, but also because I didn't belong to any political party. I had no political backing other than the president himself who appointed me. So what we had set to do in a very short time is that first, we wrote a reform agenda that had very specific, benchmarks that we needed to work towards. And that reform agenda included the restructuring of the ministry, because what we found within our first 4 months was that the ministry was too big, too large, over 5,000 staff at the headquarters that were positioned or aligned in positions that were really creating parallel structures, basically performing positions that were doing the same thing across the ministry. So wastage of resources, wastage of time, and creating unnecessary bureaucracy than the bureaucracy that already exists in government institutions. So the restructuring of the ministry was a task that we took upon ourselves and luckily completed, restructuring it to from the leadership onwards all the way to the bottom, where we were not hoping, and we did not want our staff of 5,000 people to go jobless, but instead reassign them to schools and directorates across the country where they were needed most. There was no need for a 5,000 staff headquarter ministry in Kabul. So we accomplished that. We also worked on, for the first time in the history of the past 20 years at least, but I probably won't be wrong to say in the history of Afghanistan's education system, we worked on a national education policy for the country. Completely drafted and written by our staff, myself included. It was the first time that a minister actually was engaged in writing something. And I was told this by the staff that I was working with. This is the first time they're seeing a minister actually engaged in the day-to-day activities. And we took the experience of the 20 years and beyond and wrote a national education policy that unfortunately was at my desk in its final form to be sent for a final signature of the president, which unfortunately never made it. We also dared to think of, we didn't dare, but we actually created a group to really relook at the curriculum, redesign the curriculum, because what I inherited the day I arrived at the ministry was that our 10th to 12th grade students were having 17 subjects to learn in a time frame that was 40% less than about 40 years ago. So meaning we're giving less class or school time to children, but forcing them to learn way more subjects than they need to actually. And all of the participants here are, education experts or interested in education. Our first grade students had 10 subjects to learn in a 2-hour span period of school timing a day. And, just from a educational philosophy of understanding of how children learn and, how much time needs to be given, that needed to be changed. And so we started changing those requirements, bringing down from 10 subjects down to 5 initially, and then we were going to bring it down even further. So these were things we accomplished. Of course, nothing got completed. There were the daily things that had remained. So contracts that were not paid for 10 years prior to me, agreements that were made that never had any follow-up, financial commitments or financial agreements that were made to vendors and or contractors that were just put on hold for political reasons, obviously. And so in my short time, I made sure that we at least addressed those issues. Of course, there's a lot of work unfinished, and it saddens me to this day. And I still pray and hope that whether it's this current regime or any future regimes, that they could really understand the value of what we were hoping and trying to do with the Ministry of Education by depoliticizing it, because at the end of the day, children should not suffer at the hands of politicians trying to gear the ministry one way or another. And as far as I know, I was trying to do that. And I hope that in the near future, whoever else comes to take the ministry forward, at least understands the value of that vision and really work towards providing an education to all the poor children of Afghanistan.
Thank you so much, Rangina. There are so many threads that I would like to pick up from what you have just shared with us, but I'll maybe start with one on international aid and international development, and partially because, there are so many people in the audience right now that are representing different international agencies that have been involved in Afghanistan or hoping to be involved in the future. And as we all know, as you have mentioned, Afghanistan has been heavily dependent on international aid in all areas, including in education, for decades. What did this mean for your work as a Minister of Education? What did you see as the main challenges or perhaps also main opportunities?
I guess I'll start with the challenge. The challenge with the international aid money, as grateful as we were and we are for donor agencies wanting to help societies like Afghanistan, it does not come without challenges, these commitments. Because the international donor agencies or implementing agencies on the ground, they're bound by benchmarks, by data, by requirements that they must meet in order to continue receiving more funding or to continue receiving funding of any amount. And what it does to nations like Afghanistan, remember in 2001, it's not that the country of Afghanistan was born in 2001. That's not the claim that I'm making. But the Ministry of Education, along with the entire government, had to do start from zero in 2001 because so much of the infrastructure of any system that the country may have had shattered in the 2 decades of war from 1979 until 2001. But the country was forced to develop and to make progress, to show progress at a speed that was not compatible with how life progresses in a country like Afghanistan. So while there was this push, great push to increase the number of students, which is a wonderful thing, I'm not against that, but a system and an infrastructure that is not able to sustain or to accept great numbers of students coming left and right obviously fails. And we have a proof now. Yes, in the past 20 years, with the investment that was made, there's great number of students than in the history of Afghanistan's educational system, particularly the number of girls, about 40% is the estimate. More schools have been built throughout the country that were never imagined. And more teachers have joined this sector officially. But at the same time, when you compare that to the quality of education, there is a great concern because simply getting more does not mean you get good, meaning good results. And so that was one challenge of the international community's pressure and aid. Second, I witnessed in my short time that in the 20 years prior to or 18 years prior to my assignment, a lot of international experts had come and brought in their expertise and their opinion about what is needed for a developing country like Afghanistan to have. And I'll give you an example of a curriculum intervention. So in our curriculum, I believe under social studies subject, there's a whole lesson on traffic lights, the red, the green, and the yellow. Now, Afghanistan, if we can remember and know, the majority of the country still doesn't have roads, let alone traffic lights. In the major city of Kabul, Kandahar, Herat, Mazar, traffic lights did exist once upon a time in history, but they were destroyed. And then in the last couple of years before the fall, there was a resurgence of bringing traffic lights, although the majority of people never actually obeyed traffic lights. Mm-hmm. But to put a lesson in a child's book in the primary grades level, who are studying in the middle of nowhere, middle of Uruzgan or the middle of Bamyan, who probably is not going to see, a traffic light in his or her lifetime, at least in the school lifetime, I question the relevance of putting such a subject or such a lesson in those books. But this particular example shows that even our curriculum was written and advised by experts who did not necessarily understand the context of Afghanistan. What was it that was needed in the context of Afghanistan that needed to be put into curriculum, into the structure of the education system? And this complete, wonderful effort to increase the size, to make education services available to all the students of Afghanistan. It's a wonderful mission and vision, but sustainably, realistically, was that possible? And in the past 20 years, what I also discovered was that, if these discussions had taken place that I did not know of, I apologize for that. But from what I did gather and found out, very little, I didn't find any information as to ever tackling the issue of how do you make a ministry like the education ministry sustainable? And when you depend on foreign aid all the time, it is no wonder that the system collapsed or is on the brink of collapse when a regime like the Taliban come to power, when they don't even have money to pay salaries. So these were critical issues that needed to be addressed, that if our own countrymen and women and leadership was not able to, at least the international community should have been able to focus on this with the aid money that was coming. Again, my criticism of the entire country is more money does not necessarily equals great and good results and lasting results. And the international community, I think even today, I would criticize that if the idea behind paying teachers' salary is the assumption that the education system will revive and pick up the speed, that assumption is wrong. It's good that we're helping teachers financially through channeling money as their salary. I see it more as a humanitarian response to a great need because the financial system has collapsed in the country. But the education system, unless and until the core issues are addressed in terms of curriculum revision, teacher training, even schools. There are communities in Afghanistan that don't have a school within 150-kilometer radius. Mm-hmm. And the international community was supposed to be monitoring the allocation of resources, both monetary as well as human resources. Yet the international community failed to recognize that in one village in the middle of somewhere in Afghanistan, I won't name names, 3 schools have been built in the past 20 years, literally right next to each other, and only one school is able to accommodate or utilize 50% of its space because the community simply does not have enough students. And yet you have communities with 150-kilometer radius without a single school built. These were the kind of, discrepancies or disparities that needed to have been paid attention to by the donor community, who was continuously supporting the Ministry of Education, and to allow such discrepancies, again, not only in the buildings, but even teachers. Provinces of comparable populations had a discrepancy of human resources of 1-to-3 ratio. And how are we going to question that? Unfortunately, these were information that I found. Wasn't there enough to really address it? But my call on the international community is, if we're serious about helping education for the sake of education to provide service to children across all sector or all ethnicities and all locations in Afghanistan, then let's state that and let's be willing enough to do the hard work. But if it's just lip service, then of course these programs will continue receiving lots of funding, and in the end, we will continue to live the chaotic life of Afghans that have been lived for at least the past 4.5 decades that I know.
Thank you, Rangina. We'll return maybe to this kind of the more futures thinking conversation about how can international community mobilize, currently and in the future to support education in Afghanistan. But before we get to that, I actually wanted to kind of go back in time even more a little bit, and ask you a more personal question. So for the last 30 years, for about the last 30 years, you were the only female minister of education in Afghanistan. Can you tell us a little bit more about your professional and personal journey? I think that kind of personal side would be really interesting. But also, I wanted to weave in a question from Amy Pate, who is very impressed with your ability to engage with people and have really strong vision for the education in Afghanistan. But she asks, how do you work to change the mindset of individuals who do not necessarily or did not necessarily understand your vision of education? So maybe if you can weave those two questions together. One is kind of more personal, of being a woman in this position of the Minister of Education, and the other one of working with people who may not think in the same way.
Thank you. I do want to make, it's not a confession, but just to share, because a lot of the criticisms that came towards me from my own countrymen and women was partly because I was a completely new face, a completely new name in this arena of politics at that level. And to be appointed as a female minister with no political background to a ministry that was not only critical, but it was the largest after the security sector ministries. The Ministry of Education was and is the largest ministry in Afghanistan. So it was not easy to be received well with that background. And then specifically, I did not desire to join politics. This was not my vision or mission in life. I did not go to Afghanistan to become a politician. I did what I could in the 18 or 19 years of service that I gave to my people, initially working on women's economic empowerment, and then realizing very quickly that in order to change future, whether economically, socially, politically, all sectors, the underground base for any development is education. And unless and until you tackle education at that young age, that time when the children are being formed, their mentalities and their vision for their life and their world is being formed, it's really to the education sector. And so that kind of led me to becoming the lead, the principal of the first international school that was officially registered. There were other entities, but we were the first official registered school called Mizan International School. It was a small school, it was a private school, and we quickly realized how much influence the right type of education can have on children and their families. And the children who were coming to Mizan International School not only became in love with learning, but they also enjoyed learning. And so that was the critical difference between seeing my daughter when I enrolled her in the public school sector. She would cry every single morning, did not want to go to school, to Mizan's experience where the kids wanted to be in school even on the weekend. They didn't want to go home at night. It's a very tiny example, but a very critically important example, because when a child enjoys the environment and the information that they're learning, they obviously learn more. And I'm so proud to say, and I'm happy to share this with you, my daughter has come with education all in Afghanistan. She never was taught in an American school. And she's come to ASU, and she's enrolled at the ASU, preparatory school. She actually, after 2 months or less than 2 months, she's getting all A's. And I'm not bragging to show off my daughter, but it shows that the quality of education that school was providing is no less than the quality of education that kids here in America are getting. And so I think what the president saw and why he proposed to me was that he envisioned a future for the children of Afghanistan, a different future than what we were providing through the Ministry of Education. And because he was a visionary leader, he proposed this to me. And of course, I rejected it initially. But he convinced me by saying, I know that, the Ministry of Education and working with thousands and thousands of schools is not good, is obviously not similar to what you're doing in a small little program at Mizan. But from a philosophical, visionary point of view, do you not want to let the children of Afghanistan, the millions of children of Afghanistan, taste even a bit of what you're trying to do with Mizan? And I think that challenged me as a person to wear the hat of a politician and join. But it was very difficult from all aspects. I was a woman. I was a woman who had not studied in Afghanistan. I was a woman whose mother tongue is Pashto, but the requirement of Kabul is that you're supposed to know Dari. Even though I can speak Dari and I understand Dari, but I'm not a fluent. That's not my mother's tongue. And the politics around the ethnicity, the background, the upbringing, and of course, gender and the experiences was very hostile. And it was not an easy journey to go through, particularly with the parliamentarians who were used to the idea of being served. Whenever parliamentarians used to come to the Ministry of Education, they demanded things. They demanded positions, they demanded projects, they demanded contracts. And I, in my lack of experience of how to work with politicians, I simply would question one thing. If a proposal that came to me, whether it was a position or a contract, I would question, does it benefit the children of Afghanistan? Does it benefit the schools of Afghanistan, or does it benefit the teachers of Afghanistan? Because those were the three main priorities for me as a politician in that ministry. And if it didn't, I did not accept it. And so when these people or these resumes were given by MPs left and right, hire this person, hire that person, bring this advisor. Okay, my question was, is this advisor's background in education? And if it was not, if it was international relations or engineering or other things, I did not bring that person on board. And that created a lot of animosity because they could not accept the fact that a minister could say no to them. And then particularly when they did not vote for me, they did not give me the vote of confidence, for which I was so thankful, because that meant I was out of their hold of politics, and I was so glad that I did not get their votes. And then when the president decided to keep me, regardless of the fact that I did not get the vote of confidence from the parliamentarians, that created even more of an animosity. And then that's where I really saw the ugly face of politics coming and attacking me personally, professionally, questioning me. And so personally, it's taken a toll on me. Yet I think the one thing that I'm proud of as a woman is that I stood up. I did not give in. I kept doing what I thought was right. And this was not my personal feeling. I did bring on advisors and deputies and, staff that was, in my opinion, a lot more qualified than what I had inherited. And of course, every decision that I made, I did it in a consultative way, which is, my leadership style is I don't make decisions solely by myself. And as women leaders, we tend to do that. We take in what others are saying into consideration before we make the final decision. And so it was a very difficult journey, but a journey that I think has allowed me to grow and hopefully become a better person. But it has created a lot of enemies. And unfortunately, that's one thing that I've learned in this journey is that you can never please everybody. You can never be a leader in a position where you are accepted 100% by the people that you're serving. But when you know that you're doing the right thing professionally, technically, morally, spiritually, then at the end of the day, your criticisms can say what they want as long as you're happy with it within yourself.
Thank you so much, Rangina. So fascinating. I wanted to just remind everybody that please share your questions in the Q&A or in the chat, and we'll try to weave in the discussion. And so I'll try to do this now with one of the questions from Nazir Kaihan, actually, who sent several questions. And I think thank you, Nazir, for the questions. But I think to me, these questions really point to the very complex and sometimes controversial nature of being the Minister of Education. And so Nazir is pointing out to the maybe one of the aspect of the work that has to do with the intersection of schools and mosques. So he asks, given that mosques in some parts of the country paint a picture of radicalizing environment in Afghanistan, why did you choose to move the primary education grades 1 to 3 to mosques? And the follow-up question also, how do you evaluate the role of the religious community leaders as part of the school management shuras in the success of community-based schools in terms of access, success, or retention, or even providing in-kind grants to schools? So maybe you can share a little bit.
Question. Thank you, Nasir, for that question. And before I answer that, there's another question right before that from an anonymous attendee that says, was the security situation responsible for the school allocation discrepancies? And I want to answer that because it's linked to this Nasir's question. Security was used as the reason behind why the discrepancy existed in the country. But my assessment is that security was an excuse. If we really look at the history of the past 20 years, areas that, yes, were predominantly populated by Talib mentality or conservative mentalities, the Ministry of Education, it was the job and the responsibility of the Ministry of Education to go to those areas where they were hard to reach. I mean, that's really, it's a policy-making institution. The schools do the job. And if the ministry was not able to either start or maintain the relations at the community level to convince the people that schooling was not a political service, just like the health ministry did, because the clinics continue to operate even in the most remote and the most unsafe or unsecure areas, because it was a service that people needed. So I do put the responsibility on the Ministry of Education for not being able to convince those communities that were against education. And yes, of course, there's the dilemma of the girls versus boys education, but even for boys, the effort was not made. So in retrospect, and then now will be an interesting time moving forward, because now security doesn't seem to be anymore a challenge. So how much of the international aid community's resources will actually be evenly distributed and equally distributed across the country will be a challenge that will remain to be seen. And so I say this point, coming back to Nasir's question about areas where we propose the inclusion of mosques, or bringing the gap between the mosque and the school closer together. So particularly for the reason, Mr. Nasir, that as I said, there were areas where there were no schools built in the past 20 years, and those communities remained with their children growing up in the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan's banner, or under the banner of the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan. And even after 20 years of the investment of the international community, children were still illiterate. They still had no access to school. And, the community-based education system was created in the latter years after 2017 onwards, but it was predominantly addressing girls' needs, not necessarily kids, boys. And if we look at, yes, there's the criticism of that mosques are, potentially creating terrorists, but it's a narrative that unfortunately either has been either created by, new people, the new world, versus also there is no evidence, no proper research has been done to actually prove that all mosques or all religious institutions in the country are responsible for creating terrorists or raising terrorists. the curriculum that the majority of the madrasas, even under the umbrella of the Ministry of Education, the curriculum that they were using had nothing that was, terrorist promoting or terrorist related. Let's not forget the politics that the majority of terrorists trained were across the border in our neighboring country, and they continue to be trained in that capacity. So whether you officially recognize the mosques or not, terrorism will find its place to train its citizens, and it's not necessarily institutions. And from a political point of view, a mosque existed, and there was a GPS survey done by the president's office. There was a mosque within 2 kilometers of distance across the country. And the resources that were shrinking towards the latter part of the Islamic Republic did not allow us to be able to build a school, for every village in Afghanistan. And so the idea of utilizing the masjid or the mosque as a potential physical space for learning, particularly in the primary grades of 1, 2, and 3, where kids are under 10 years of age, they're not allowed and they cannot physically go to distances far out to go to a school. So instead of having the children wait another 20 years for them to become uneducated adults, we said, why not utilize the space of masjids? And when we were proposing this idea, it did not mean that from the time we announced, every school all over Afghanistan would have all the children going from grade 1 to 3 to a masjid and then the remaining in the mosque. This was a sustainable conversation for the future of Afghanistan, understanding and recognizing the limited resources we had. And in the process, if we could bridge the gap between a masjid that is feared to be training and raising a certain mentality to come more in line with a moderate and a spiritual form of education, raising a good Muslim and a good Afghan, I think in the long run, it was the ideal solution, and it still can be the ideal solution to a particular case like Afghanistan. Unfortunately, this fear of child molestation, which is another issue that was brought up. I understand. I'm a mother. I have a young daughter, and even if she was a son, I would have the same fear for my young son. Child molestation is a reality, is a threat to humanity, and we all adults, responsible, teachers, need to be concerned about this issue. But why do we, allow ourselves to be preyed by the assumption that child molestation only happens in an environment called a masjid? We have cases in Afghanistan, and of course, this was unfortunately not discussed openly and publicly, but schools were also environments where child molestation happened. And yet there's never a question about sending our children to schools. And yet immediately we jump to the conclusion of, if you send a child to a masjid, that child will automatically be molested. So there's a lot of, deep discussion, deep challenges for us as citizens of Afghanistan that we needed to, as a country, as a people, as a population, to start the conversation, start these important conversations around our ideologies that we had created. The other problem was just this disparity between how we treated graduates of these modern schools versus how we treated the graduates of madrasas. We give the same exact certificate. The 12th grade certificate was given and issued to both. And the question to me, as someone who's responsible for this, I started questioning, okay, we give the same diploma. So when we give the same diploma, the assumption is that the madrasa kids and the regular school kids have received the same education for 12 years. Yet when it comes to college entrance, we as an institution limited the madrasa kids to only pick 3 subjects in their higher education: Sharia, law, or Arabic language. Mm-hmm. We never allowed a kid graduating from madrasa to apply to medical school, engineering school, humanities, or any other subjects. But yet our modern school graduates were always able to pick any subject. So the injustice or the stereotypical mindset that was institutionalized at the ministry was something that needed to be addressed. And finally, the whole idea of bringing religious education and modern education together to coincide with one another, there's this assumption by many audiences that I talked to, that Afghanistan had a secular education curriculum. That was never the case, and that is not the case even now. The school curriculums, the hours that were dedicated or supposed to be dedicated to Islamic education, or topics in Islam, in addition to the science, the mathematics, the language and literature, the Islamic education subjects and hours are still a great number. So it's not that the modern schooling was a secular curriculum and then the madrasa had a religious curriculum. It's true that the madrasa curriculum was heavily, much more focused on the religion aspects of it, but it was not, a black and white slate. So our proposal was that if we want the education system, the whole ecosystem of education in Afghanistan to become sustainable and to be able to speak to every citizen in the country and start to erase this dilemma of me versus, a school graduate versus a madrasa graduate and vice versa, the intention was to bridge that gap. And unless we do that, the country will continue to suffer this clash between which school you came from, which kind of education you've received. And we as a nation needed to have that dialogue. And that was my intention in beginning it. Was it the right time? Was it the right space? You know what? That's a question that I don't think any one of us can ever answer, because I was the minister at a time when maybe it was not the most conducive environment to bring this topic up. But then again, how do I know that had I not started that this conversation would have even begun? So yes, there's criticism to it, but I hope the audience now understands that the intentions behind such a move or such a proposal was very pragmatic and practical and technical, and in a way to bring two very different groups of people together to start thinking as one Afghan, one Muslim, because for nation building, the Ministry of Education had a huge role to bring the nation together. And of course, it's a long-term investment. And we see it now as a result of being in the diaspora all over the world, the ugly reality of the Afghan population being so divided over ethnicities, over language, over the mentality, over where they graduated from. It is now very visible that the Ministry of Education, unfortunately, in the past 40 years, have not completed its mandate of bringing the nation together, which in any country, ministries of education's, one of its prime mandates is to bring a nation together, to create that identity that a nation needs to be able to sustain itself for a future as an autonomous nation.
Thank you, Rangina. Let me shift the gears just a little bit. And I wanted to make sure that we also have time to talk about this question. So it's almost impossible to think about Russia's invasion of Ukraine without comparing it to the military strikes and resulting humanitarian crisis in Afghanistan. There are so many striking parallels, but also very painful realization of the double standards emerging inside of these comparisons. I just wanted to use this opportunity today to ask you, what are your thoughts on this?
Thank you for bringing this up, and absolutely the discrepancy or the double standards. I would say it's very visible. I am aching. My heart is aching with the people of Ukraine who are not only dying but who are forced to displace themselves. I recently, about 6 months ago, I myself was displaced, along with family and friends and colleagues. And this is the third time in my life that this has happened. I don't know before my death how many more times I'll be forced to do this. And so it is an unfortunate thing that we're all experiencing and witnessing as a global community and humanity. But it's interesting just comparing the response given from the international community to Ukraine's government versus my own government in Kabul prior to August 15th. I remember our previous president simply, and I could hear this very clear through his words, that he was not asking the international community to send more troops or send more aid. But I think it was obvious to say, at least allow us as an institution, as a government, to be able to handle our own affairs and not empower, a group called Taliban, to come and fight against us. But unfortunately, it is because of the international community's continuous efforts to engage with the Taliban in Doha for 3 years prior to the fall, to potentially even support them financially. I mean, we don't know. We don't have access to that information. To make agreements, let me also point this out to all the educational experts on this platform, that UNICEF had made an agreement with the Taliban in Doha without the knowledge of the Ministry of Education to provide education to communities in Afghanistan where the government supposedly did not have access. And we did not know that until the agreement was publicized through international media. And then, of course, UNICEF Afghanistan retracted that and said no, that there was no agreement. But in record, and right now, we do know that even an institution as apolitical as UNICEF was even engaged formally with discussing and making agreements with the Taliban. So it's just interesting to see how politics plays its role in a poor country like Afghanistan, where our president refused to bow down to the international community pressures of bringing a recognized terrorist group and kind of handing over power officially, because our president recognized that we had a constitution and the transition of power needed to be done through an election, which is the legal way of how transitions need to happen. Yet the international community did not endorse that legality in Afghanistan. And seeing the international community's response and support, not only financially and militarily, but even morally, the platform that has been given to the leadership of Ukraine, it's a very interesting thing to look at as an Afghan in exile who was in government, who's now witnessing, unfortunately, something similar happening to Ukraine. I hope the war does end. I'm praying for peace and stability in that region sooner than later. But the international community's double standards definitely are visible. And unfortunately, this speaks to the ugly politics that go beyond just at a country level in Afghanistan, what I experienced, but even at a global level, politics, unfortunately, do play a huge role in how people make decisions and move nations and people in one direction versus another.
Thank you, Rangina. We only have about 5 minutes left, and I would like to just weave in together several questions, but they are all kind of future looking. So what do you think is next in store for education in Afghanistan? How can the international education community mobilize? What can research community do to support the people and education in Afghanistan in the present moment? And the final question from Vahid Omar. He asked, we're hearing that some Afghan female professionals are returning to Afghanistan to work. Will you return to your post if asked by the de facto government? So all future thinking from the international community to you personally.
Thank you. I actually have 5 specific things that I want to share and how I envision moving forward for anybody, whether it's governments or donors or implementers or researchers interested in working on the education sector in Afghanistan. Number 1, we must continue to expand equitable educational access for every child. From the 20 years of experience, we have learned that when access, when equality is disregarded, the response of communities, people speak up. But the expansion must be at a pace that is organic and that is not dictated by failed time-bound international mandates. We need to be flexible to make sure that communities and environments and societies differ. Just like cultures are different, languages are different, how people work are different. You cannot apply a same mandate or requirement that might be successful in one continent and expect the same results in a continent where Afghanistan is. Number two, we must move beyond the brick and mortar schools as the only pathway towards a 12th grade diploma and embrace an educational ecosystem that offers multiple flexible pathways to gaining a 12th grade degree. As we're talking, the fourth industrial revolution is taking place. There needs to be a willingness to think outside of the box. I challenge all experts and researchers and implementers and donors to not see just a school, a building that we build as a school as the only place for getting an education, particularly in an environment like Afghanistan, and particularly for girls in Afghanistan, where the school might not be able to provide the education. We need to challenge ourselves to think, how can we take education to an environment where it might work for her? And I think she deserves that right for us to think. Number three, we must ensure that the curriculum respects the desires of every Afghan citizen. Afghan families and students must see their religious, cultural, and international aspirations reflected in the curriculum. The curriculum in Afghanistan is not simply a conversation around a non-religious versus a religious curriculum. The curriculum needs to be relevant and needs to speak to the needs of the Afghan society. Number four, we must distribute education resources equitably between all provinces, rural and urban centers, and between boys and girls schools. And number five, girls' education must not be used as a political tool. It must be advanced, protected, and solidly ingrained within an Afghan context. And only then are we going to be able to see progress in girls' education. And finally, I want to end it with Mr. Wahid Umar's question. I will say this to when the Taliban did ask me to meet with them after the fifth day of the fall. I think it was around August 20th when they asked me to come meet with them. I did take the courage and went to meet, which of course, unfortunately, also received a lot of criticism from my Afghans because they thought that simply meeting the Taliban meant I had joined their mission. But the purpose of my meeting was to first show that I, as a woman, was not afraid of them, that I, as a woman, was willing to sit and talk to them. And I, as a woman, was willing to make them understand where I come from, particularly in the position that I was. And they did pose a question to me, whether I was going to leave the country or remain in the country. And I said, Afghanistan is my home. I was born here. My father is buried here. He was sacrificed for this country. And I said, I would like to also be buried in my country when the time comes. I said, nobody, no entity can ever take this country away from me. It is mine and I am the country's. I said, if I take a short leave to go to my adopted home of America where all of my family lives and my mother lives there, and she's an old, ill woman, it is my right to go and have that liberty to be able to travel anywhere in the world that I feel comfortable. And I said, and when the time comes, and if there's a need for me to come back, whether it's in a position, of course, not a position with them, or even as a sweeper, as a vendor, as a teacher, as a worker in any capacity. Luckily, I've been blessed, and I take pride in this personally. I don't need to be a minister to make a difference in my country. Mm. I can be a small little speck trying to do a very little menial job, but still take pride in the fact that I'm contributing to my country's development. And when the opportunity is right, I promise that I will return. Again, it does not mean that I have to join the government of Taliban. The people of Afghanistan's population is 40 million. Taliban is maybe 1% of that, or if even. And so if I return to work for my people, when the time is right, I will make that decision. But I want the audience to also know that I have a 12-year-old daughter who is my responsibility, my personal responsibility, and she's a girl. And her future is just as important to me as the future of Afghanistan as a nation.
Thank you so much, Rangina, for such an insightful conversation and for sharing your story, your thoughts, ideas about the past and present and future of Afghanistan with us. I also would like to thank all of the audience who joined us today. And for those who were not able to join, we will share the video recording of this conversation. So many, many thanks to everybody, and especially to Rangina for sharing the time with us.
Thank you. Have a great day, everybody.